Cool beans. Hey, Joli. Thanks for coming on the podcast today.
Hi, Shane. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for being here. You're a very interesting person, and you do really cool work. And you define yourself as in addition to being a depth psychologist, right, a relationship coach who colors outside of the lines. And you work with people who engage in various kinds of non-monogamous or creative monogamous relationships. And that's really what we're here to talk about today. And it's your area of expertise. And so it's going to be a lot of fun.
Absolutely. I love this topic.
Yeah, it's your whole life's work.
My whole life.
So maybe, we can just start off with just a bit of a clarification of terms, right? One of the big terms that people use these days is ENM, which is ethical non-monogamy. So what does that sort of mean to you, and how can we kind of understand that for for the purposes of this conversation?
Yeah. Well, I appreciate that you start right off with defining terms because, scholarly rigorousness, we want to do
Yeah.
that. There are a couple of umbrella terms that are used to describe non-monogamy because obviously non-monogamy can happen in a non-consensual, non-ethical way too, right? Ethical non-monogamy is one of those umbrella terms. I see it as sitting next to consensual non-monogamy and being a little bit different in when we really drill into the semiotics of it. But most of the time, people really mean what I'm doing is above board.
Hmm.
I am practicing having more than one partner who is in an intimate type of relationship of some kind, because let's remember intimacy is not just one thing, and everybody involved knows. That said, whenever we're talking about something that stands outside of our cultural norms, we should
Hmm.
remember that we need to ask each other what we mean. So even though on most dating sites now, you can just check a box that says, oh, I'm open to non-monogamy, or I'm open to ENM or CNM, I like to just really take that moment to ask people, what does ethical non-monogamy look like for you? Because that's where we find out really how people are living this. And that's actually more important than any objective definition of the term.
Right, because I suppose there's the creative freedom to define these relationships as you wish, and it will look different for different people, and so it's important to be able to have these conversations with each other or with your therapist or something like that, where you at least know what you're talking about.
Right. And, on my own podcast, I recently did an episode all about the taxonomy of non monogamy because there are so many different relationship styles. And really, once you start getting into it, you realize, oh, a label like ethical non monogamy, well, everybody wants to think of themselves as ethical. But I get really specific and
Yeah.
think I only use that term when I'm talking about having a very specific ethical framework through which I filter my decision making and how I form my relationships. Most of the time, I'm not actually being that formal. So instead, I use the term consensual non monogamy because
Mm.
for me, that denotes the idea that I know that I am telling other people what I'm doing if they are involved with me in any intimate way, but it doesn't necessarily say exactly how I let that work out in my life.
Right. And I suppose, under the umbrella of consensual non-monogamy, it sort of implies that it fits within your ethical framework anyway, right?
Yeah.
Like it would be weird if it wasn't, or you're just deceiving yourself.
Right. And so here, a place where we can see this jump, this usually makes a lot of sense to people. Someone could have an arrangement with a partner
Hmm.
where they've agreed not to discuss really any of the details. So the last conversation that happened was we agreed to be non-monogamous. We agreed that we don't want to share any details at all about this. We usually call this a don't ask, don't tell relationship. And if that's what everybody agreed to, I could definitely say then I am ethically non-monogamous.
Yeah.
And so that's where I have to know because personally, don't ask, don't tell doesn't usually work out really for me. It doesn't like feel like a good fit in my body when I actually
Hmm.
get into those relationships. And so for me, that's not the right fit. That's why I always ask refining questions.
Right. And I suppose, in recent times, there seems, at least from my perspective, there seems to be quite a significant uptake or rise in certainly the acceptability of non-monogamy, but also in the sort of how prevalent it seems to have become.
Yeah, well, let's talk about prevalence. Like then by the numbers, we don't have data going back that far. But what data we have tells us that somewhere between 5%, 6% of people in North America are practicing some sort of consensual non-monogamy at any one time. And yet, up to 20% have tried it at some point, right? And so if you just think about that from a data's perspective, we know that means we know people for whom this has been true, right? Like if it's 20% of people who've tried it. But I think to your larger point, the conversation is happening. So we don't have tons and tons of data, but we do know that in white American culture, for example, this wasn't really talked about in the 1930s, right? We know it wasn't really talked about in the 1950s, but all of a sudden, fast forward to here, and you turn on any TV or movie and you might hear the word polyamory. You might hear somebody say the word throuple, right? And so the conversations are having. I have been personally interviewed by the New York Times, by Vogue, with questions about this topic. So it has entered our general conversation. And to me, that's a good thing, because that means that we can ask more refined questions from there.
So, I don't know the right way to frame this question without it sounding bad, right? But
go for it. You won't hurt my feelings.
No. So from a psychological perspective, right? Like, why do people choose non-monogamy, or is it something that you're kind of wired towards, or is it just like, do you learn that sort of behavior?
Yeah. Okay. In my studies, I look at this in a particular way. So I study non-monogamy and specifically jealousy in both monogamy and non-monogamy. And so I ask people questions about their relationship structures all day long. I ask the question this way. I say, do you come to non-monogamy from the perspective of an orientation or a philosophy or as a choice? When people are asked this question, generally speaking, they reflect for a moment and think, oh, well, I think it's an orientation. Like, I'm just built this way. This is how I am. This is how I always knew myself to be. Even before I knew the words for it, this is how I recognized myself. When the words came into my lexicon, all of a sudden I was like, I feel seen and known. For other people, they hear about non-monogamy. They maybe read a story about it, then they listen to a podcast, and then they read some books and they're like, oh, philosophically, that just aligns for me. That makes sense. So whether I'm practicing it or not, I identify with that. And philosophically, I feel aligned. And then still other people feel very comfortable in either a monogamous or non-monogamous experience, right? We might call them ambiamorous. And those people decide. They make a choice. You might even say they make a lifestyle choice about how they're going to day-to-day behave in alignment with whichever selection they've made.
Right.
Now, I mean, that's a good thing. Like, so if you have these different ways of looking at it that feel good for different people, awesome. It does, however, create some confusion because some people refer to non-monogamy as a lifestyle. But if I feel it as my orientation or a deeply held identity, that can feel invalidating. So it's a bit tricky. And that's, again, why we want to ask people about their experience rather than assuming before we've said too much.
And would you say that which of those three categories would you say is most prevalent, or is it kind of a mix of all of them?
Well, that's actually a tough question. And here's why. When we are talking about the numbers, right? We're talking about who's willing and able to discuss their non-monogamy in a safe way, which means we can't actually get that data yet because currently our society not only rewards monogamy, it does. I mean, it gives us actual tax benefits and health insurance benefits, right? So it rewards that, which, okay, fine. But it also can be very risky. People have, been threatened and had, DCF, visit their house because they have been persecuted essentially for being non-monogamous or being accused of being it. And so I think it's really, really important to say, we don't actually know. We don't know how many people feel like, oh, my orientation is this. They might not feel safe to act on it or even to answer that question authentically. And so right now, I would say we don't have numbers for that. We do, however, have some interesting numbers around some pretty large studies that tell us that, for instance, millennials, when asked the question on a u.gov panel, they said about 30% of them said that non-monogamy was their ideal relationship style. They didn't say that they were living it. They didn't even say how important it was, but that they thought that that sounded ideal. So we definitely need more data, but before there's really going to be an answer here, we're also going to need to create safety through these conversations, really.
Yeah, and I think that, people who are choosing that style, or, as you say, the millennials who would prefer it, how many of those people do you think actually live it in the sense? Or is it kind of like an ideal that they're like, oh, it would be great to have, more than one partner. Like, I don't want to be limited to one person, or I don't know. I'm just making up hypotheticals here, because I could understand the motivation of someone saying, that sounds like a really cool thing, when maybe they haven't tried it yet, or they don't really know what they're getting into. And that's okay. Maybe they have to try it and it works or it doesn't work. Right. But so it would be interesting to know the depth of that thought process.
Yeah. And now here, we're immediately in another problematization. I don't even know whether that's a word, but we've got it right now. Okay. Because if someone doesn't feel safe to try it, or they don't feel like they have access to it, or they don't want to disrupt the life that they already have in order to try it, then is it fair to say that they couldn't do it, or that it might be too hard, right? Not really.
No.
Until we have broad acceptance, we wouldn't really know whether this is just another variation that actually makes up a huge number of people. We're probably still, unfortunately, a few generations off from that. I don't know that I'll live to see it in my lifetime, but I do know that just the numbers I already gave you, like if 20% of people have tried consensual non-monogamy at some point, that's the same number of people as who have cats or who play musical instruments. That's a lot of people. And when they tell their stories, often the things that they talk about being hard and difficult are the same things that monogamous people talk about being hard and difficult. Communication skills and managing jealousy and dealing with life with another person. So in many ways, I think we really are a ways off from knowing how many of us there are.
No, I think that's a fair point. And I think that maybe that's something that what you said about how, they face the same difficulties as in monogamous relationships. Perhaps it's just slightly different, but, jealousy, for example, like I would say that's, I would guess, one thing that people are most likely to bring up in asking about it. Like, aren't you jealous, or wouldn't you be jealous? Or I don't know what the specific questions would be, but something along those lines, because most people sort of seem to have this sense of like, that wouldn't want to share their partner with someone. Right? Maybe they're happy to share themselves with people, but wouldn't necessarily want to share their partner with someone else. But that's true if you have one or two partners, right?
Right. So many people do ask that. That's the top question, right? I mean, I chose to study jealousy in the non-monogamous container first before I went on to do monogamous studies, because I knew that I could find a bunch of people who would talk about jealousy, because, well, you're just opening the door and inviting jealousy in. But here's the thing. Monogamy offers no protection from jealousy. Nothing. Just think about it for even a second. What is it about monogamy that stops jealousy from happening? Absolutely nothing. You have a promise. In non-monogamy or in monogamy, you have relationship agreements, whether they're spoken or unspoken. And then you have a world out there. And some of us trust our partners a lot, and some of us trust our partners less to keep those agreements. And often we hope, and we even imagine, that monogamy will protect us from jealousy. But since we know the studies show us about 2/3 of domestic violence reports have some indication that jealousy was a cause, I don't think those were non-monogamous people by and large. Therefore, we just know that jealousy lives in monogamy too. The difference is non-monogamous people who are intentionally, consensually crafting relationships, they have to be a bit more proactive, and they have to deal with what jealousy looks like in a pretty open way, because they're making agreements that invite situations where they will come face to face with it, and they'll have to deal with it as a norm, right? Like, we know jealousy is going to come home. What are we going to do?
Mm-hmm.
When I talk to monogamous individuals in my other studies, frequently they're like, well, I feel jealous, but I mean, I shouldn't have to. I think, cool, but you do. So the question of jealousy is a big one, but most people make an assumption that jealousy is unworkable, unmanageable, but it is no more unworkable or unmanageable than anger or sadness. It's an emotion. So it's something to learn about, and non-monogamy puts people in the position to have to learn about it.
Mm-hmm.
So that's what happens.
That makes sense, because I would think that in monogamous relationships, jealousy is often not dealt with in the best way. I mean, I don't know if it's dealt with particularly well generally in any relationships, unless the people are ready and willing and mature enough to be able to deal with it and confront it head on and learn from it and get the, benefit might be the wrong word.
No, go for it. Benefit. I'm a jealousy enthusiast. There is a benefit.
Oh, really?
Yeah,
Okay.
absolutely. Well, just think about it. If you confront jealousy, you are confronting your psychological complexes. You are confronting your abandonment issues. You are confronting your deeply rooted physiological and psychological needs. You have to identify what they are. You have to be able to negotiate for them and ask for what you need. And then you need to be able to self-regulate.
Right.
Tell me that's not a whole list of benefits if you could do all those things.
Yeah.
So.
I see it really facilitates growth and insight or individuation, if you want to use those terms, because it does force you to really contend with what's going on inside you and why you're feeling this way, if it's, which I would assume most of the time to be inappropriate.
Right. So like, so the words that typically get used in psychology are, is this jealousy? Is it rational? I don't love these words, but these are the words we see. Is it rational or mundane or normative? Does it make sense, right? Is there evidence, a reason why you are bothered? Or is it irrational? Or sometimes people will even call it pathological. Is it based on no evidence at all? And if people are dealing with jealousy, no matter what their relationship structure, and they confront their own evidence, right? They are offered an opportunity to work with their stuff, their psychological material, which doesn't actually excuse anyone like intentionally inciting jealousy, which does happen. And that happens in all sorts of situations. So I don't want to excuse bad behavior around jealousy or the instigation of it on purpose, though lots of people do. But it is a productive emotion when it's dealt with in a mature manner, which doesn't mean it's not painful too. Yeah,
I would say if it's done on purpose, it's pretty manipulative, right?
Yeah, sure is. Sure is.
And that's not going to be great for anyone.
Exactly.
But like you said, it's just like any other emotion. It serves a purpose. And if you have the, insight to be able to look into it, either by yourself or with someone else, then there's great wisdom to be found in it. And, you're able to grow yourself and transcend it.
Well, yeah. And I would actually say that you might transcend an instance of jealousy, but jealousy is archetypal. And so since it's archetypal, we know it's a universal pattern of behavior or a readiness for action. That tells me that there's going to be a negative and a positive side to it, right? And when jealousy comes up, if I become aware of it, I'm going to have a range of ways that I might choose to respond to jealousy that offer me growth potential, or offer me an invitation into more intimacy with my partner by really, like you said, meeting it with them. Or I can meet it with inner hostility. I can be furious, or I can blame someone else for my feeling and ask them to change what they're doing so that I don't have this feeling. And this is just a wide range of how people deal with jealousy. And I don't believe we ever transcend it, because I don't believe that we transcend feelings. Like, I would never say I've transcended anger ever. Like that does not sound logical to me. But I would say that I have strong skills for managing anger. And I have strong skills for dealing with anger in the face of relationship. So jealousy for me is the same way. I learn how to deal with it so that when it comes up, I can feel it, I can name it, and then I can deal with it in productive ways.
Yes, it doesn't overwhelm you or control you.
And sometimes it does overwhelm me, but I still have tools to act on that. Like any archetypal emotion, right, can sweep us off our feet. That's actually how we know it's archetypal, is that it's both totally banal and overwhelming. But once I have tools for working with jealousy, the very first one is, can I recognize jealousy in my body?
Mm-hmm.
And that's what I determined out of my studies. It's that people who successfully navigate jealousy, regardless of what relationship structure they have, they can recognize the signs of jealousy early.
So what do you mean in my body? Like, how does one recognize jealousy in the body?
Okay, so it's going to be specific to you. So when you imagine yourself with a partner who you care about deeply, because right, jealousy is always going to be a triangle every single time. It's me, my beloved, and a perceived interrupter. So the perceived interrupter might be a real person I witnessing flirting with my partner, or might be someone I imagine exists in their world, and I check their socials and all the stuff, and I imagine that there's this interrupter. When that perceived interrupter comes into my awareness, what do I literally experience as the sensations in my body? So if you just take a moment yourself and imagine that scenario, do you feel tightness in your chest? Do you feel twisting in your stomach? Do you feel a wrenching pain? Do you feel an openness? Do you feel lightness or heaviness? Do you feel heat? Do you feel tingles? Do your fists clench? Do you get ready to run? Do you feel your heart rate increase? All of those are the somatic messages of jealousy's presence. And from there, if I note a name like, oh, this is jealousy in my body, now I've named it. Every emotion becomes more manageable once we can name it.
Right, so because you recognize it.
Yeah, and now I can start to actually apply the appropriate tools to it, right? So like when I feel jealousy personally, I feel tingles that run up the back of my neck, and I feel a clenching right below my rib cage. I know that those are my signals for jealousy. And so rather than treat myself like I have a stomach ache and go take a Tums, I instead name jealousy and I'm like, oh, I know that my next cue is to do some self-care. For me, that means going for a walk and calling a partner or a close trusted friend and asking for reassurance about my general worth as a human. So I do those two things, and I have those things written down on a sticky note to remind me to do those things, because jealousy is overwhelming and I need a plan for dealing with it when it comes up.
And would you say that each person's jealousy stems from unique experiences in their life?
What I would say is researchers can spot jealousy as early as 5 or 6 months old. And so it's there, you're evolutionarily programmed for it, you're hardwired, we could say, for it, because it's designed to keep you connected to your primary caregiver, right? Who is literally your source of life at that point. And so that root is just you, my attachment is my life. But then we have a whole life, right? And we go through toddlerhood, and maybe we have a sibling show up, and how jealousy is handled between siblings. We call it sibling rivalry, right? How it's handled, that'll leave a fingerprint around what jealousy is. If we're shamed for not sharing things, or for even talking about jealousy, or if nobody ever talks about jealousy and we just think of it as a sin, all of these things might also leave fingerprints about like, what is jealousy and what do I do with it? Then we go through our adolescence and we start having relationships, friendships, romantic relationships, whatever they are. Each of those might expose us to different jealousy scenarios that go better or worse. So it's yes, and we have this sort of root, this evolutionary truth about, yeah, jealousy served a purpose. And then it's colored by how jealousy is handled throughout our life. And then whether we're ever given the opportunity to talk about it, because when we don't talk about jealousy, it becomes more and more difficult to deal with. And most people don't talk about it very much.
Yeah, I suppose why would we? Except, I mean, I'm not saying we shouldn't, but like...
No, but like, it's not part of the monogamous paradigm, but it is if you're non-monogamous.
Because it has to be.
And because the conversation has been forwarded. So when people started writing about non-monogamy, right? And books get passed around and podcasts happen and all that. Yeah, the common question is, or the comment is, I could never do that. I'd be too jealous. So every non-monogamous person I know, and all of us who work in leadership in any way, I'm a coach, lots of therapists, lots of educators, we all talk about jealousy because we know it's going to be the first question that people ask. And so who else have you ever asked about jealousy who could talk about it the way I do? Like probably no one.
Yeah.
I'm very comfortable talking about it because I know that most people don't have a container for it. But when I turn to a non-monogamous circle, what I have found when I look out amongst the non-monogamous participants, they're ready to talk about it, even though they may find it incredibly painful, horrifying, difficult still, but they're ready to talk about it. When I turn and look for monogamous participants, they frequently are like, no, I don't want to talk about that. Why would I want to talk about that? They often don't even talk to their therapists about it because unless somebody brings it up, why would you want to talk about it? Because jealousy can also raise questions of self-worth. Like if I'm jealous, I might think of myself as bad, but also if I'm feeling jealous, I might feel like I'm being demoted in value next to my partner. There's so many reasons why we might hide jealousy from ourselves. And one of the primary differences in my comparative study now, which the results are just coming in now, is that non-monogamous people have a place to talk about jealousy. They have some kind of community, even if that community is just online, and really Facebook group level community, but they have a place and they have a normalization around jealousy. Monogamous people tend not to have a container to talk about it and tend to not know that they need to because monogamy makes a promise that you won't have to. You promise yourself to this person and you're not supposed to have to deal with jealousy.
And so it incites feelings of shame.
Shame, or just a complete unconsciousness. It may live entirely in the unconscious until it pops through the surface.
That's going to be fun.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's always fun when unconscious stuff just suddenly pops up and you're like, God damn it.
Exactly. But this is also why I find non-monogamy for me is an individuation path. If you choose for it to be. It doesn't have to be. Plenty of people do it from a very unconscious place, but you can, because it's going to bring stuff like this. Like every time you want to move your individuation journey forward, what are you doing? You're taking material from the unconscious best as you can and trying to bring it into your awareness, right? Bring it into your consciousness. Jealousy will do that all on its own sometimes. So
yeah.
It is. I mean, is it painful? Sure. And there can be a really clear point to it all.
Yeah. And I wonder why it's not discussed as much in monogamous relationships. Like I understand what you're saying, that there's this expectation that, well, in this agreed upon dynamic, it's like, well, there is no jealousy, right? Yeah. Because who am I going to be jealous of? Because we commit to each other only, right? And then when you introduce at least a third person to that, well, then you're like, well, we have to deal with this now because that hypothetical agreement of none of us need to be jealous now changes because I need to know how we're relating to each other in a three or more people kind of a way. Whereas when it's just two of you, you're like, well, if I feel jealous, that's my problem, or I don't want to deal with it, or it's too painful, or you project it, as you said, and then it's their problem.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. And here's the thing. I work with an enormous number of therapists. Like for some reason, a lot of therapists come into my coaching world. And so, so many of them have told me, yeah, I never even thought to ask my clients specifically about jealousy. We see this in another place too. So I also train sex therapists and educators. It's part of my job. I'm a certified sex educator. And I tend to do train the trainer type trainings. And most therapists don't think to every time they meet a new client, and then as they go through the work, they don't think to specifically ask, how's your sex life? How's it going? And then introduce that and then continue that line of questioning as they build trust, right? So they're leaving sex out of the room. Someone has to invite it in. Jealousy is the same way. Someone has to invite it in. And if the professionals don't know how to invite it in, and the people don't know how to invite it in, I mean, this is why I do this work. I care about this work because I believe that this is an untapped resource in
Yeah.
our social fabric. Whatever's going on with jealousy, I think it's at the root of our cultural complexes.
And so is sex, right? And so why do you think so many therapists choose not to bring it in?
Because it's really uncomfortable. It's really uncomfortable. We got no sex education to speak of. Most people in the US got no sex education. Worse, we got purity culture poured all over us if we were raised in anything. And I mean, yes, there's all of the different churches that might pour purity culture, but there's also just, I grew up in New England. New England is steeped in puritanical values. So it's just everywhere we look. So sex is in the shadow. And yes, we have half naked people all over the place, but that is not the same thing as bringing sex and eroticism fully into consciousness, right? So since that's in the shadow, well, jealousy brings up that same level of discomfort because we've already named like what it brings up is really intense somatic feelings that usually tap all the way back into your pre-verbal wounds, your attachment wounds, your relational history, and your self-worth. So why don't therapists bring it up? Because therapists have work to do too. I do too. Like I continually have to unpack jealousy because it's hard. I continually have to do my sexual shadow work because it's hard. And I'm continually bringing that material into my own consciousness.
And because we like to avoid pain, right?
Yeah.
Who likes
Who
to
wants to do all that
confront this
work?
stuff? Yeah.
Yeah, it's exhausting some days. Like,
Yeah.
really? Again? Yeah, again.
And it's a never-ending process, which I think is important to recognize and accept if you're going to do this kind of stuff, because then you're not going to disappoint yourself by never getting to the finish line. Like, you don't resolve everything, right?
Right.
It's always
There's
a
no
work in progress.
individuated.
No.
You don't get done. And the thing is, jealousy really is in the shadows. Even the APA defines jealousy as a negative affective state. Like that, let's write, like pull up the definition right now. And that's what it says. Anger. Yeah. Anger is, they say, anger is can be a healthy emotion if expressed certain ways. So we've managed to pull anger from the shadows a little bit. We're making some sense of it. That's what I want to do. I want to pull jealousy into a neutral position, which is the appropriate place to hold any archetypal pattern in a neutral position, and then look at what do we have to learn from it, both personally and collectively. And so that would be my path, is to just bring it into that place. And I mean, in doing so, it means that I've invited jealousy into my life every damn day. So yeah, I get it. It's uncomfortable. It's really uncomfortable.
And then do you find that the longer you sit with it, the easier it is to deal with?
Yeah, it's like flexing a muscle. It's the more times I have followed, I have a 5-step framework that came out of my research that's like outlines sort of the path through jealousy to make a particular incident productive, right? So I need to notice that it's happening in my body. I need to name what's going on and then name all the emotions that came along with it, like anger and sadness and guilt and shame and fear. And then I need to figure out what story I'm telling myself about the jealousy. Then I need to be able to name the needs I have around it. I like going through those steps, right? Like that's effortful and helps me understand that it really is a process. And I don't have to do it all at once, but there is a process of integrating this icky feeling stuff. And one of the things that does for me, so I'm non-monogamous. That's my actual life. I relate to non-monogamy actually in all 3 ways. I could choose not to, and philosophically and as an orientation, it aligns. So I'm always having to do my jealousy work. It is exhausting, but with some thoughtful attention put to it, it can also go faster. So now, because this is a thing that I deal with in my day-to-day life, I feel all that stuff and I know what to do next to keep it moving. Because the uncomfortable part is when it gets stuck and it's just sitting there like a lead balloon in your stomach. That's the tough spot.
And also what I found is like with difficult emotions is that it often, when you face it, it feels worse first. Right?
Oh yeah.
And so that is very off-putting. But if you can sit through that, then you can get to the release part, right? Or to move through it or move past it or get to a place where it's not as intense. but it does suck to feel bad and then to knowingly face worse first, right?
Yes. Yep. Absolutely.
That's a really tough thing to, to do, especially voluntarily when you don't really have to.
Exactly. That is exactly why I think many people look at non-monogamy and they're like, are you kidding me? No way. Right off the bat, the jealousy alone, like, sure, sex with other people sounds great, which, by the way, it's not all about the sex. It's far more about calendars, but sex with other people sounds great, but I would be so jealous. And so, yeah, why sign up for it? And so really, if you're just thinking about life as a bit of a ledger for a moment, for me, working with jealousy is worth it because non-monogamy brings me a bunch of other things that I enjoy and give me pleasure, and not just the sex, but connection and intimacy and openness and freedom and all these other wonderful things that happen in my life because I'm willing to wrestle with jealousy and my calendar, like I said.
Yeah. Scheduling's a nightmare, I imagine.
I mean, I have 7 children.
Wow.
And I have more than one person in my life as an intimate partner. So yeah, that's why I laugh when people think it's all about sex. I'm like, nah, it's about scheduling.
Yeah. It's a very task-oriented, approach. But so I think the other point that you mentioned is interesting about narrative, right? It's the stories we tell ourselves about jealousy, about things in general, and presumably about, relationships. And what stories people tell themselves about their relationships is very interesting because there seems to be an obvious instinct to pair with someone, right? I'm not necessarily saying it has to be pairing only, but to be in relationships, that's by and large the norm, right? And that makes sense. If you want to look at evolutionary, yeah, fine. We got to mate, we got to reproduce, we got to have offspring. Fair enough.
But that doesn't mean we have to stay with them. Like mating makes sense, but if you look at if we look at animals, like almost none of them are monogamous by like the human standard of monogamous.
Yeah.
Because why would they be? They don't need to be. Even if they're raising their offspring, well, okay, but then we're done with those offspring and then, right? So, I mean, it's an interesting question. Why do we do this? Monogamy is a really human thing. Like it's a human construction. Like I do think it serves a purpose. I think anything that we have spent this much energy on definitely serves a purpose. And if monogamy works for you and it's your jam, awesome. And yeah, if you just look at the rest of all of the species, there are no monogamous primates, right? Like there just aren't. So there's something up here. We constructed this for a reason, but I think it's a much more socially constructed reason than a natural, like when we say natural, we usually mean like our DNA drives us to do it exactly this way. But people will tell you that that's why pair bonding exists.
So what do you think that reason is, that social construct?
Power. It's a great way to control. I mean, if you just think
who?
Everyone. So who controls marriage?
The government?
Yeah. And who did before
the church?
Yeah. And who collects the money from people?
The government.
And church.
And church.
Especially if you go back, right? And what happens when you own property?
You pay
taxes. Yeah. And so when we start seeing laws around the rigidity of monogamy, not just, hey, I like this person more than any other person. And every day I wake up and I just like this person. They're awesome. That monogamy to me feels very natural. I get up every day. I really like my person. Awesome. But when you start having property and you start having laws that tell you exactly how you can flow money and property through things and how money is collected and then redistributed, we are definitely dealing with power. Marriage as we know it isn't that old. Most people until 150 years ago married for reasons way other than love. 150 years.
Yeah.
That's not very long. Before that, it was usually either survival. You just needed someone to help you like stay alive, or the marriage of two families in order to continue to consolidate power. It's a great way. Telling us all that we have to live in this particular way is also a great way to stop us from living communally. What would happen if we lived communally? Would we have the same structures? I don't know. It's so long ago, who could say?
Yeah.
But I know colonization made that happen in a lot of places. there was communal living, colonization happened. All of a sudden, you have to live as a monogamous, pair bonded, raise your family, do it all yourself. It changed the structure, the very fabric of what we call normal. And it's not that old.
I suppose there's many polygamous tribes and societies, right?
Yeah. If we go back before our white, heteronormative, mononormative history, yeah, every culture was some form of communal living, which may have included all sorts of non-monogamous structures, because monogamy only makes sense in the context that we know it now.
But you think it's like white heteronormative in the sense of like it is also prevalent in many like Asian communities and, Middle Eastern places, monogamy's there too, and that they're not white?
Actually there's lots of polygamy and lots of it.
Yeah.
Lots and lots. And
I see what you're saying. Yeah, that's fair.
Yeah. So I don't like, that's not my specialty, but I can tell you, if you look historically, if you look anthropologically, we have lots of evidence that monogamy, there's nothing normal. Like there's nothing that just automatically flowed and said, oh, we have to do monogamy this way. Even if you were talking about pair bonding for the purpose of raising children, yeah, but why do we all live separately? Because that doesn't really necessarily make sense either. But as soon as you add property into the question, now it starts to make sense. So start looking at the history between, say, 1200 and 1400. And then it starts to look a little different. And also, we lived a lot shorter period of time. So it wasn't that hard to stay married to one person. You were going to live for 35 years. Okay, I put up with you for 20 years. Sure. It's just different.
A good point. Yeah. And also, I guess, so do you think that this was done like strategically? Because it would have to be continued every generation of like the people in power would have to like knowingly enforce this stuff, as opposed to it being set up in tradition. And then everyone's just playing their little part in the world that they don't really.
Well, tradition has strong gravity. Absolutely.
Yes.
Tradition is peer pressure from our ancestors. Absolutely. However, we know, just look at American culture right now. We know that there are people who are consolidating power all the time.
Sure.
We see that. Has every generation had people who are consolidating power? And do we have monarchies that pass that power? And do we have non-monarchies that are absolutely passing powers? People like the Rockefellers, like the Carnegies, right? Absolutely. For many generations, power consolidation has been an important part of the strategic development of our human history. I think that power consolidation has been a really, like, we can't discount it. Imperialism is imperialism because it's imperialism. And so when we look at something like love or marriage or sex, to take it out of the context of a world that has been colonized, right, in a very specific way, would be to kind of ignore some really important stuff.
Right. And I suppose if you're looking to control people, like you look for what drives them. And sex and relationships are right up there.
Sex, relationships, and children. Because now once a baby has been born, am I willing to risk doing what feels right if my child's life is now on the line? Because that's actually like...
What do you mean?
Okay, so I'll tell a personal story here, because we are. It's almost 2023. And in 2009, I came out as non-monogamous. And I almost had my children taken from me. I came incredibly close to having my children taken from me in 2009, because I loved more than one person, because we were happy, we were healthy, we could provide for them very well. And that almost happened. So now let's press the rewind button. First off, there are people who did not have, I could hire lawyers, I could defend my children. But let's press the rewind button and say someone is going to be, hung or flogged or punished or have their babies taken away. Are they willing to say, I love these two people and we're raising our family together? No, because capital punishment and corporal punishment have been real. So yeah, I do think it's been intentional. I think that control is a great way to consolidate power, and it feels good to a lot of people. Like control feels good to a lot of people. all for its own reasons, right? We could get into a whole thing about power complexes. And so I don't know how many of my ancestors might have been oriented the way I am, because would they have told me? Would they have told anyone? But I can tell you this.
Not worth the risk.
Yeah. When I came out though, I was loud. I was like, hey, this is my reality. Deal with it. I was already out as queer and I'd been married to a man. So like people were already used to me coming out. But when I said, hey, I'm in love with two people, we're going to make this work. Everywhere I turned, I heard, ugh, that never works. That never works. You're playing with fire. That never works. They didn't say, oh, what is that? They said, that never works, which tells me they know about it. And in fact, when I started asking more refined questions, yeah, every single person I asked who'd lived on a military base while the men were in Vietnam, they all knew about non-monogamy. Sure, they did. Everybody who'd been doing key parties in the 60s, they knew about non-monogamy. So they had some information, and they watched it not go well. But there was also no safe way to have a conversation. And there was no internet. I was able to go to the internet and say, where are my people? Let me try to find them. And it took years, but now you can literally find those people at the touch of a button. So you don't feel alone. And so you said, I've seen an uptick in this. Yeah, I don't think it's an uptick in the numbers. I think it's an uptick in people saying, hey, this is just a way to be. This is just an option. And now they can safely find enough community to not feel crazy.
As they should, right?
Yeah.
Like, but, why not?
Yeah. And really, to me, it really lands home when I think how far we've come just in the last decade. So who knows what the real natural is? We're going to need a lot longer to decipher whatever that is, if there even is such a thing as natural.
Right. And there also seems to be moral objections, not from me personally, but people would say that it's, immoral or whatever. And now, if you're coming from a religious perspective, fine. Like, you have your religious doctrine and that's where you get your moral code from. But if you're looking at it like a non-religious perspective, I think there are still people who would say it's immoral for some reason. And I don't really understand why people have objections to the way other people want to live their lives that doesn't impact them, unless it's some form of projection.
Cultural complexes, right? Like,
right.
What's going on? Why in the world did it take till 2015 to have equal marriage rights? Why are we fighting about this again in 2022, trying to secure marriage rights for humans, right? So yeah. Why? Because people are really easily driven by fear. And what we don't understand and we don't talk about causes more fear. I have never had a human ever in my life come up to me and say, you are bad and evil because of what you're doing, when they just see me out grocery shopping with my 7 children and my husband, and perhaps another woman is with us or perhaps not, right? Never happened. But boy, have I been yelled at on the internet. This week I was harangued, and someone who I work with was harangued because I was a moral aberration to them. So yeah.
But the internet's the perfect place for displaced anger and projection.
Exactly. And so when you talk about that morality, this person was willing to write it with their name and business attached. They were talking, this was a strictly business networking event, right? Morality has taken on a tone. We feel like we can just make decisions and make pronouncements about how other people live. I don't know whether it's always been like that, but I know it's still happening. And I know that queer people are not safe still in much of the world. And just as recently as this week, a warning was issued for United States living queer individuals. A terrorism warning was issued. We haven't come as you can look it up on our, we have there's those threat levels, the threat level warnings that the US government will issue. There have been recently enough attacks on queer people to make the government have cause to say, there's a terrorism warning. This isn't safe. it's not okay. And be careful where you travel and be careful where you go.
What are you supposed to do about that?
Nothing but be scared, I guess. But it reminds me that in my liberal bubble, I might feel safe. But, just this week, I talked to somebody deep in the heart of the Bible Belt in the US, and they were terrified of trying to figure out what to do. They're already in 2 relationships. They're very happy. What do? What are you supposed to do? If you're in my position, you come out and you keep having these conversations, because I have the privilege to be able to do that. And I feel safe to do that. And I feel ready to defend myself. If you do not have that privilege, then you protect yourself. And I completely honor why you would do that. And I'm sad. And I will keep doing psychological work, because I think that the underpinnings of this are bringing more of our cultural unconscious material to the forefront and saying, yeah, why do you think you get to decide this? Because when we get right down to it, where there is power, there is no will to love, right? That's what Jung said. So
Yeah.
It's a question of power or love.
And especially in many places in the world where, even being gay is illegal and criminalized. Like there are places, many places like that still, which is madness. But also, as you said, it was only like within the last decade that, gay marriage was legalized.
Right. And it's not safe. Like we're literally having this argument in our Senate and our House right now again. Like we're not even close to done. So when I think about hauling individuation material out of my personal unconscious, and I face the pain that is, you described, like, yeah, it is painful. But my doing that is how the needle moves for all of us.
Mm-hmm.
It's not just about me.
No, you're right. And if people are afraid to talk about it or don't talk about it, then it gets worse.
Right.
Or if they're prevented from talking about it.
Exactly.
Which is even worse. Now, just to switch topics a little bit, a word that I've heard you use before is compersion.
Yeah.
Right, which is a term that I've never encountered before. Could you tell me like a little bit about what that means and why it's good to know?
Yeah, compersion is a great word. And who doesn't want more vocabulary, right?
Yes.
Compersion is a word that was coined in the 1990s in polyamorous communities. Polyamory means many loves, right? So these are non-monogamous people. The term was coined to name a particular emotion. The emotion is the feeling of joy for another person's joy. Right? There are other words that are similar. Confelicity and Freudenfreud. These are other words that have similar connotations. Mudita comes out of Buddhist tradition, sympathetic joy. Compersion, though, it does not need to live only in the polyamorous world. And this is how I know how. Compersion is about feeling joy for another's joy, even if that joy has nothing to do with me. Everyone feels compersion. I mean, you'd have to go full Ebenezer Scrooge to not feel compersion, because when you watch a little kid having an ice cream cone, even if you're lactose intolerant and you're like, I am not going to have that because, nope, that's not for me. But you watch their joy licking that ice cream cone, you're like, yes, I want to sit here and watch this. This is adorable. And it fills my heart with warmth. And I have this wholehearted sense of joy for their joy.
Right.
Who doesn't want more of that? It can also be thought of as an antonym to jealousy, but you don't have to not feel jealous in order to feel compersion. You can be in a place where you're like, I am wrestling with some jealousy around fear that my partner is going to disappear, but I'm also excited that they're having experiences that they really love. We're complicated. We can feel more than one thing at a time.
Yeah. Because I really love the term, because the vicarious joy is something that, is not really ever spoken about. And it's an important part of just, I think, relationships in general, in terms of being happy for your partner or partners in their happiness, right? Without having to concern yourself with the way you fit into all of it, right?
Exactly.
And really just allowing them their joy, and then hopefully they do the same thing for you. And it's important to really get to terms with being happy for other people and not feeling jealous, because you don't need to, right?
Yeah. And because I'm always working with jealousy, a lot of times people imagine that they have to stop feeling jealous, or that jealousy will turn into compersion if you just do enough work. But I like to unpack that a little, because in fact, so if jealousy is a triangle, right? And I am in fear that my love bond will be interrupted by a perceived interrupter. And then my partner is, let's say they're at a party and they're standing across the room, and I see them engaged deeply in conversation, and I can tell all the way from here is about physics. He is deeply engaged. He's talking about Ravelli and he is loving it, and he's being asked questions, right? And I'm watching that, and the person he's talking to is beautiful and just his type of human. And I'm like, yeah, absolutely. I might feel all of my sensations of jealousy percolate up. And at the same time, because I know this person, I care about them so much, and I know them so well, and I can tell already, like, he's making his hand gestures. I know he's talking about physics. I'm like, yay. I absolutely feel the vicarious joy that he is getting out of this interaction. And so now I can sit with my discomfort about jealousy, and I can think about the strength of our agreements and the strength of my trust for him. And I can be with all that, or my distrust. I could be really fearful, and I could still look for, because there's the thing, you have to go looking for compersion because we weren't trained to see it. I can look for, hey, am I also happy for them? And if I am, cool, because who doesn't need, it's like a lozenge for a sore throat. It's nice to apply it. But the raw material of compersion isn't jealousy. So when people say, I want to turn jealousy into compersion, I say, let's detach that. They're two separate emotions. And you can be feeling jealousy and feeling compersion. And we can work on feeling more compersion and less jealousy, but it's not an either or. And we don't try to turn one into the other, because compersion's raw material is joy.
Right.
If I want more of it, I need to focus on joy.
And what would you say jealousy's raw material is?
Comparison is part of it, but that's the envy piece. So envy can live inside of jealousy. So if I perceive myself as not being valuable in comparison to this perceived interrupter, so I might be envious, because envy is different from jealousy. It's about longing to be what someone else is or have what they have. So comparison is one of the raw materials. A lack of self-worth can be one of the raw materials. A lack of clear agreements, just at root. Do I even know what my partner has agreed to? So many people tell me, oh, my partner knows the rules. I'm like, tell me more about that. Tell me more about your agreements. And they go on to talk for a few minutes, and within a few minutes, they realize, oh, crud, we have no explicit agreements. We have a bunch of implicit assumptions. And we've never really talked about what this
Whether they're the same or not.
Exactly. Yeah. And so there's, in between my implicit assumptions and yours lies a whole lot of gray area. And in that gray area is a lot of room for jealousy to appear, boom, pop up from the unconscious. And when it does, it's the easiest thing for me to do is to point my fingers at you and say, you did this to me. You caused this jealousy. It's you. You change what you're doing so I don't have to tolerate this feeling. And that's missing a couple of really, really brilliant opportunities, because in that moment, you have the opportunity to A, deal with the feelings and get used to dealing with big feelings in productive ways. B, learn how to regulate our nervous system. And C, actually ask for what we need from our partner and make conscious, explicit relationship agreements and have shared meaning and shared language. And that's what I do with people all day, every day.
And that's the designing of your relationship.
Exactly.
Right? Is to figure out what works for everyone involved and be explicit about it in a way that works for everyone.
Exactly. Yep.
And it's such a crucial point, because that implicit assumption that people have that isn't talked about, you kind of assume that they're in agreement with you when they're probably in agreement with some, or maybe even most of your stuff, but not all of it. And that's where things going to get messy, is that not all of it part.
Right. And sometimes they might be in agreement with you in certain contexts, but not in others. So let's use that party, for example. Perhaps I have an implicit assumption that my partner will not have, now I do not condone this myself, will not have conversations alone with a person who is of the apparent opposite gender. Gender's not a binary, let's pretend he's Mike Pence, and I think he shouldn't have a conversation with a woman. And he's like, well, we weren't alone. And I say, yes, you were. And he says, no, I wasn't. And I said, yes, you were. You were all the way over there in the corner all by yourself. He's like, we were standing in a room with 100 other people. Right in there, right? There's the gap between, we might have agreed on that thing, but there's always going to be a gap where there is not a clear agreement. And here's the thing, no agreement is going to be enough to cover every context. So we actually have to learn how to have guiding principles and then decision-making processes, so that when we run up against those areas where we are like, oh, we did not actually, we're not in alignment here. What do we do now? Because most of us don't want to end a relationship over a heated physics conversation, right? That's not the thing.
No.
No. So if I don't want to end the relationship, then what do I do? And a lot of people treat jealousy like a deal breaker, but they don't even know what the deal breaker is. They just flip out. And I ask people to get really clear. Your deal breakers need to have, there needs to be a process behind them. If this is a deal breaker, then what happens next? What are the next 3 steps? If you have that kind of agreement, then even though I know for certain you are going to come up against situations where you don't agree on whether you are each in alignment with upholding your agreement, but now you have a process. And if you can trust yourself and you can trust your partner and you can trust the processes that you have in place in your relationship, then what is there to fear? Much less, much less.
Would the processes be communication strategies and like debriefs, or what do you mean by process?
Yeah, so some of them are debriefs, scheduled, planned revisiting of our relationship agreements, but also things like if one of us is experiencing, say, jealousy, what will happen? Are we going to go to a coach or a mediator or a counselor? Are we going to issue divorce papers? What happens next? When I say processes, it's actually there could be a pretty complex set of processes that go on in your relationship, or there could be a pretty simple set. For some people, these processes they sort of boil down to once a week, we do sort of a state of the union check-in. Once every quarter, we make sure that we're on the same page by going away for a weekend together, really sinking into our relationship, shutting off our phones for 48 hours and really diving into just being with each other and having a few intentional conversations about, hey, has anything changed? What's going on for you? And then if you're like me, every 3 years, you decide whether you still want to be married. Every 3 years, my marriage is up for renegotiation. And that includes, this could be done. This could be the off-ramp. Everybody's processes are going to be unique, but I like for people to know that they have processes that work for them.
Sorry if you hear the dogs growling and barking in the background. Okay, so I have a better understanding of what you mean by processes. It's like what's going to happen if and when this comes up. How do we deal with it? How do we preempt this stuff? You know, in your case. So are you saying every 3 years you sit down and you reevaluate whether you should be married or not?
Yeah, absolutely. We did this on purpose.
I'm assuming so. That you did it on purpose.
We did that on purpose. We weren't sure we were going to sign on the dotted line anyways when we got married, because it's a little complicated to be married to a human. And doing this, just a little bit. And nobody tells you when you get married the first time, like exactly what you're signing up for. But when you get divorced the first time, you find out what you signed on for. So this is our second marriage, each of us. And we intentionally, every year, we do a full renegotiation of our relationship agreement. We revisit it. We go through all the stuff. Who's allowed to do what is not really the question, but what do you want out of this? And what is okay for you? And what's a boundary right now, right? So we do all of that. And I have a whole process that we go through. I mean, I do this all day, every day with people, but also every 3 years. And so we just had one this past September. we spend a whole weekend talking this through. But one of the things that happens is the first day of that weekend, whatever one we set aside that September, is so this is it. Like, are we going to stay married, or are we going to renegotiate and consider ending this? And either of us can show up and just say, so I do want to reconsider whether we stay married. And a lot of people ask me if that's scary, but in fact, I think it's absolutely the easiest part of my marriage, because I know every single day we wake up and we say, I choose you, I choose me, let's do this together. And at a regular set of intervals, we have talked about why we're together, what our relationship's purpose is, and what we're going to do to keep it working for both of us.
Mm-hmm. And it keeps
really
you
easy.
focused on it.
Yep.
Right.
All the time.
You
Yeah.
don't get
And
complacent.
Right. And this is in the face of having other partners. So it's not like we don't have other options. We do. And we like waking up next to each other more often than not.
I've never heard of that before, but that's fascinating. And you present a very compelling case for it.
Well, I will add this, I call my person who happens to be a husband. I'm queer, but here I am married to another man. And I call him my anchor partner for a reason, because we are anchored together in this life by children.
Mm-hmm.
We didn't have any biological children together, but we committed to each other's children. And that means we have 7 children together. And we decided that we wanted to be able to grandparent together, even if we didn't want to be romantically or like householding together. So that's actually our longer term agreement is, hey, it's okay to exit the romance. It's okay to exit the finances. It's okay to exit everything except the familial, collegial family. Like, hey, we're people. Let's be here for those kids. And that to me means far more than, will you stay married to me? So that's my anchor person. So, everybody has a different set of rules and wants in their life. And for me, that's much more grounding.
Wow. I mean, that's great. And I think it's so important to be able to have that, right? And that's what's going to keep you both together in some sense, right? Whatever that looks like.
Yeah.
And also that you prioritize your children, right? Because that's very important, I would say.
And because we have prior marriages, we know what it looks like to not be able to stand next to somebody and parent well. We didn't want to do that again. And so it's challenging to know how badly things can go in a relationship and do it anyways. Second marriages are so filled with hope, right? Like how messy it can get. And you're like, here we go. Let's do it.
Yeah, you're not naive like the first time.
Exactly. And there's something really beautiful about it. And to my mind, when I signed on for this marriage, I knew it was also non-monogamous. I knew what I was choosing. And I knew that meant we were always going to be having to attend to this relationship as if it were new. And, it needed to continually be in a cycle of death and rebirth. And that's what makes it an individuation relationship for me. This is about, like, the marriage is literally part of my individuation process, which means I'm more committed to my growth than my comfort, which is hard.
And do you think that that's how people should treat all marriage and all relationships?
No, I don't. I think that many people feel very well held by a comfort-based relationship. They feel very well held by the comfort of the society that we currently live in, and they like it. And it's not for me to decide that they should do anything else. I think that there are some people who really do want individuation-oriented relationships. And they don't know that they exist. And so they often turn up in my office somewhere between the ages of 37 and 60. And they're like, I think I need to do this different. And I say, great. I actually have another option for you. Let's talk this through.
Yeah.
But for all those people who are like, I like my life to be oriented around comfort. I think, cool. My father, my mother, they loved that. That was their life. Comfort first. Cool. That was their choice and they get to do it. And I'm perfectly happy for them. That's how they lived. That's how they died. And that's not my choice. That's not what I want. So I'm all about the freedom to decide which way you want this to go.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. And it's about finding what works for you,
Yeah.
right? And or making what works for you. You have to figure it out first.
You have to
But
figure it out. You're right, though. You do have to make it. I mean, I'm about relationship design,
yeah,
which to my mind, a relationship like a house. We just renovated a 1930s house, the whole thing, gutted,
yeah,
rebuilt. And the thing that the contractor said to us that struck most home, it really hit me. He said, well, here's the thing. A house is a living thing. I'm going to walk out this door. I'm going to finish. And he just finished and he closes the door behind him. And the next thing, literally the next morning, a handle off of one of the only remaining cabinets from that 1930 house, a handle went plunk and fell down. And I was like, Adam's not here. Now what? Because it's never done.
yeah,
Right? The house still needs attention. My marriage will always need attention. And that attention isn't actually about some objective thing that exists separate from me. It's me. My partner and I have an overlap. And in that overlap, in the Vesica Pisces that exists, right, in the Venn diagram of us, that thing is alive. And we have to tend to it and continually redesign it. Because the marriage that I made when I was 20 did not fit me anymore when I was 33. And I left it. But you know what? The marriage I made in 2013 didn't fit me in when we renegotiated 6 years later in 2019. So we redesigned it.
right. And so it's about that continuous process of redesigning your relationship in order to suit both or everyone's needs. Right?
Yeah. Yeah, that's it.
And that's complicated because it's scary, because it leaves people with uncertain futures, which is not something that many people like, but that's the reality.
But the reality is marriage makes no promise that you have nothing. It makes you no promise. And if it does, if you imagine that your marriage makes you no promise, then in fact, I want you to think very carefully about whether you might be in an abusive relationship. Because if you have no way to renegotiate or redesign your life, you're not allowed to bring that up. You're not allowed to talk about it. You're not allowed to renegotiate. So I also happen to teach kink and BDSM skills. In a kink relationship, if somebody can't renegotiate, we call that abuse. And we say, oh, nope, this is not BDSM. That's abusive. We should always be able to talk about what we need as we grow and change. So I think that even if you like the comfortable container, there always needs to be an out. And in fact, in modern American culture where I live, we have one. It's called divorce. That's the out. I feel much more comfortable knowing that I and my clients can turn to their partners and say, we need to renegotiate. I know it's not actually our renegotiation time, but I really do need to renegotiate right now, because many, many, many people wake up every morning and say, crap, I need to renegotiate. So I guess I call a lawyer. I don't have to call a lawyer because we have a process in place that lets us renegotiate. And if it gets to the stage of lawyers, then it will have been through this process that also counts around our feelings. And we will engage with people who help us work through those feelings before we get to the lawyer part.
Yeah, it will be the last resort, so to speak.
Yeah.
In terms of...
Or it will be a celebration because we're like, this marriage was complete. Great. Actually, what we found out is we're done, and we can do that in a great way. In non-monogamy, I always tell people that the goal isn't longevity. The goal is graceful transitions between your relationship states. And I don't know about you, but ungraceful transitions out of relationships have caused me more pain than almost anything else in my life. And I have walked through 5 very close people dying near me. So I know pain. The ungraceful transition is excruciating. I prioritize graceful transitions, which means, really having to unpack our assumptions around what divorce means. Because what if it was something to celebrate?
Yeah. Well, I think usually it's a celebration for at least one person.
Frequently it is. And often both people, after some time and processing, like, oh,
It was
Oh,
bad.
okay. I see.
Yeah,
I
yeah.
see why we needed to end that. Right.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay.
No, for
Good.
sure. Listen, Jolie, this has been absolutely fantastic. Thank you so much. Where can people find you, find more about you? I know your podcast is called Playing with Fire. People should check that out. jolihamilton.com. What am I leaving out?
So if people are curious about non-monogamy and they're just thinking like, okay, but seriously, people don't actually do this, right? I want them to go to joliquiz.com, Joliquiz, joliquiz.com. There's a 10-question quiz. I derived it out of my doctoral research and my long years of experience, designed to help you figure out where you are on the spectrum from, oh, hell no to, oh, hell yes. And from there, you'll get an invitation to come and learn more about the 5 pillars of opening up in the right way for you, which doesn't have to be about sex, doesn't have to be about your whole life. It's about learning what opening up might be and learning the skills of doing it well. And I offer those monthly on a monthly rotating basis. So if you take the quiz, you'll get invited to come attend a salon and just learn about how do you do this well? Because nobody wants to do it badly.
Yeah, you might as well have someone show you the way.
Exactly.
Don't
That's
fumble along yourself.
if you're going to play with fire, let's do it well.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much. I look forward to having you on again. It's been an absolute pleasure.
This was lovely, Shane. Thank you for having me.
See ya.